developers with existing AX 2009 setup, reference, or parameter data forms and would like to migrate those forms to the AX 2012 style. Let's look at the simplest pattern first. We'll start by importing our AX 2009 form into our AOT as I've done here. Our goal is to take the logic and fields from this form and move them over into the AX 2012 form. When we're done, we'll preserve the functionality but match the AX 2012 style. We'll simplify this form by removing the tabs, giving more space to the grid, and simplify functionality by adding new and delete buttons and an action pane strip at the top of the form. Let's begin our migration. The easiest way to do the migration is to begin from a template. So I'm going to open up another AOT. On the left-hand side, I'll have my line of business application in the 2009 style. In my right side, I'll have the 2012 version of that same form. I'm going to start by expanding the Forms node, right-clicking and saying New Form from Template. From there, I'm going to select Simplest. The Simplest template provides all the functional components of the simplest form. To migrate an AX 2009 form, we need to simply copy over the data source, fields, and methods to provide the business logic. Let's start by copying over the data source. Next, I'm going to set the data source property for the action pane strip and the grid in my new simplest form. Next, I'm going to make sure that the same fields are populated in the AX 2012 grid as were represented in the AX 2009 grid. Code and description. I happen to know that business ID is code, so I'll drag that down into my grid, and then description. As this is a simple form, I don't have any other methods or business logic to copy over. Therefore, because I used a form template, most of the work was already done for me, and that's all the effort it takes to migrate the form to the AX 2012 style. Now you can see if I open them up side by side, there's my new form in the AX 2012 style with fully working new and delete buttons. Now let's move on to a more complicated migration, the AX 2009 to AX 2012 Simplest in Details form. Here we have an AX 2009 setup form. It has an Overview tab and a General tab. The AX 2012 Simplest in Details form is for setup forms that have 6 or more fields. This form has 7 fields, so it's a candidate for conversion. The goal is to take the AX 2009 form and migrate it into the Simplest in Details pattern, as you see here. We'll do that through a series of steps. The first step is to implement a form style of Simplest in Details. Then we'll take the right side buttons and move them over into an action pane strip. We'll also add new and delete buttons. Next, we'll add a body container group, a grid container group, a details container group, a details header group, and then we'll move the existing grid into the grid container. We'll add a vertical splitter. We'll put summary fields in the details header group. Then we'll move all the existing tabs into the details container and change them into fast tabs. We'll start by migrating our AX 2009 form into the AOT. You can see I've done that here. The most simple way to migrate the form to the AX 2012 style is to create a new form from template, then copy over the data source, fields, and methods that make up the business logic. When you create a new form from template, all the container groups that were discussed in the overview, plus some optional groups, are provided for you. So I'm going to go to the right-hand side AOT, the AOT that I'm going to use for my AX 2012 work. Right-click on the Forms node and select New Form from Template. From the list that appears, I'll select Simple List and Details. When I expand the Design node, you can see the groups that we discussed in the overview are already there. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy over the data source. Now that I have the data source, I'm going to set the data source property for the action pane and the grid. Next, I'm going to move the right side button group into the action pane strip. And I can simply do that by dragging and dropping. Next, I'm going to populate the grid with the key fields necessary for identifying a specific record. The Simple List and Details pattern, the grid is used as an overview grid. Therefore, you should limit the contents of that grid to only those fields that are used to identify a specific record. The recommendation is to limit to 2 fields if possible. In this case, I'm going to select Pay Cost Type and Description. And since the overview grid in the Simple List and Details pattern is read-only, I'll have to repeat these 2 fields in the header area. Next, I'm going to copy over the tab pages from the AX 2009 form to the AX 2012 form. You can see that the template has created a fast tab for me and a tab page. So in this case, I only need to copy over the groups inside the tab page in the AX 2009 form to the tab page in the AX 2012 form. Since this form has no other business logic, and I used a form template, the migration is completed. You can see now I have an overview grid with 2 key fields. Those 2 fields are repeated over here in the header, and then I have a fast tab that contains the remaining editable fields. My right side buttons are now in the action pane strip, and I have working new and delete buttons. In this example, the only other remaining work is to add a tab page name. In your case, you may have other miscellaneous cleanup or adjustments specific to your form.